Well, good afternoon. Officially, it's 12 o'clock, noon, high noon, time to start. I was given a cartoon. You ever read Pearls Before Swine? And it's these two pigs. And the first picture says, hey, pig, what are you going to give up for Lent this year? Second pig responds, nothing. I don't even like it. Why should I give anything up for it? In fact, if it's up to me, I'd just get rid of it. First pig, I didn't know you felt so strongly about Lent. Second pig, oh, I thought you said Lent. First pig, you're rather confused. Second pig, religion is such a tricky subject. We continue our study in this personal journal of Solomon. Remember, Solomon's towards the end of his life. And Solomon has used his life as an experiment on, is indeed life a gift from the hand of God and was created by God to be good? Tov. Remember, the word means designed by God to extract enjoyment from it. But a whole lot of people live life, and life seems to turn out more like a curse than any kind of gift. And so people are miserable. You say life is a gift from God. They want to argue with it. Well, the difference is this. One is the response of a fool, and the other is the response of one who is wise. So the whole issue of wisdom. And this is why this book, Ecclesiastes, the Hebrew word is kohelet, that it means preacher. This is Solomon, who basically has his whole life as this experiment. So he says, I'm going to try it all. See, Solomon doesn't have to go out and battle and fight and increase the kingdom. And you remember why? His dad did all that. Remember, Solomon's somewhat of a trust fund baby. You know what I'm saying? Is that King David, he did all the fighting. And so Solomon had 40 years of peace during his reign. And because when you're a king and you're at peace, you don't have anything to do. So he decided that he would, with this double portion of wisdom that God had given him, that he would go ahead and he would live life to its max. And that means all the pleasures that actually that produce happiness and strength and success. But he'll also, remember, he said he'll test madness. Madness is deception. It's when people promise that these particular pleasures are going to somehow, be enjoyable and make life worth living for you. So at that point, he says, I'll do it all, but I'll do it with my wisdom. And that's why when you study Solomon's life, his life doesn't always end up so fantastic. He's got all these women, a lot of them are political relationships. Some people even wonder, does Solomon end up in heaven? I'm pretty sure we'll see him there, but I don't think he's going to be the big deal there that he was here. But God did use him and his life to demonstrate why it's better to be wise than to be foolish. Remember, he begins his journal by saying the first thing you need to know about life, it's havel, not hell, havel. Remember, the word means vaporous. Life flies back right by you. And no matter what pleasure is out there, it's going to have a beginning and an end, and it's going to fly right by you like a vapor. That is the enjoyment of it. And so maybe you'll enjoy it for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, a half hour, one evening, one day. But there will be an end. And then what you're left with, remember, it was the second word he taught us, was yatron, the aftertaste. That's where you can extract the enjoyment from that temporary pleasure that you had. And so it's the yatron, it's the aftertaste. And that's why if I'm wise, then I will extract enjoyment from pleasures, but I will have the wisdom to know what pleasures will have an aftertaste that will cause me to laugh and to smile and to want to go back and visit with memory and be proud of. Versus if I'm foolish, I'll make choices, bad moral choices, promising in madness to make my life more enjoyable. But the yatron, the aftertaste, is nothing but shame and guilt and damage. And I hurt my life, I hurt my kids' life, and at the end of my life, I think this whole thing was absolutely a curse. And so when we come here now to chapter 7, we're going to be looking at verses 9 to 14. Here in chapter 7, verse 9 to 14, remember he's saying part of enjoying life is realizing that God has packed your bag uniquely from everyone else. That is, God has a unique plan for your life. Remember in Psalm 139, when you were in your mother's womb, the days ordained for you were already established. The days, not just the length of days, he knows how long you're going to live, but the days themselves. That's why he says in Philippians 1:6, God will complete, Jesus will complete what he has begun. He will accomplish what he has begun in you. So God has a plan for each and every one of us. And we need to basically, in a sense, look at our own bag, stick our nose in our own bag, because if we struggle with envy and covetousness, remember in the 10 Commandments, the way the Hebrew poetry is put together, first word's the most important, last word of the sentence, second most important. And with the 10 Commandments, the first had to do with what? Loving God with all your heart, soul, and your mind. No distractions with idols. But the last commandment is the second most important of the 10, and it has to do, don't covet. Don't get involved in envy. Don't be sticking your nose in other people's bags and wishing that the plan that God has for them is the plan you wish. Because you look at everybody else's life, and it looks like they get all the prosperity and all the breaks. Then you look at God's plan for your life, and it seems to be, feels like it's full of adversity. And that doesn't seem to be fair. So in wisdom, I respond to, how do I navigate the uniqueness of God's plan being unfolded in my life? And the answer is, I better accumulate this thing called wisdom, or I'm going to blow the whole thing. And this whole book is called one of the 5 wisdom books. You see, in the Hebrew canon, the 39 books, it is 3 sections. The first 17 books are called historical books because they have to do with history, the past. The last 17 books of the Old Testament are called the prophetic books because they have to do with the future. But sandwiched between these two, you have these 5 books called wisdom literature. And that's where you have the idea of what they call affirmative wisdom. How do things work so I can be successful to enjoy what God has given me? Well, there you got Proverbs. There you got Psalms. There you want to be romantic. You got the Song of Songs. But you also live in a world that doesn't make sense and seems to contradict itself. It doesn't seem to be right, doesn't seem to be fair. And so you also have acceptive wisdom. And that's the book of Job. And that's the book of Ecclesiastes. How do you navigate in a world that doesn't always make sense? How do you stay with the plan when you don't like the plan? And so the answer is by wisdom. And so here, what he's going to do is he's here in chapter 7, he's dealing with the objections of why we may want to bail out of the plan that God has for our life, as if we can do that, by the way. And so this whole issue of wisdom, what's the big deal? Why is wisdom such an important thing in the scriptures? As a matter of fact, you go with Proverbs, which is affirmative wisdom. For example, he says in chapter 2, verses 2 and following, Proverbs chapter 2, verses 3, really. 2, 2, 3, 3, 2. Let's go 2. He says, make your ear attentive to wisdom. Incline your heart to understanding, for if you cry for discernment, let your voice be for understanding. For if you seek her wisdom as silver, and search for her wisdom as for hidden treasure, well, then you will discern and fear the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. Remember, the whole scripture talks about fearing God, fearing God. The Hebrew word for fear is the word yareh. It's exactly the same thing as the Greek word pistis in the New Testament, which is translated faith. Faith in the New Testament is exactly the same thing as fear in the Old Testament, and they both produce the same thing, obedience. See, faith isn't faith unless it's obedience. Fear is not expressed as fear of God unless it produces obedience. Here he says, well, how do I learn to obey even the plan that God has for my life instead of fighting the thing? He says it has everything to do with wisdom. Verse 6, for the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright, and he is the shield to those who walk in integrity. So not only is wisdom is something we're supposed to be going after, its worth is greater than riches. He says this in chapter 3, verse 13. How blessed is the man who finds wisdom and the man who gains understanding, for it's his profit to better than the profit of silver, and its gain more than fine gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing yet desire compares with her. Notice he keeps using the pronoun her, female, to tie to wisdom. So ladies, next time your husband's giving you a hard time, remind him of this fact. When you think of wisdom, you think of her. But he goes on to say in verse 16, long life is in her right hand. That is wisdom. In her left hand are riches and honor. He says her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are at peace. She is the tree of life, so take hold of her. And so this wisdom is not something we just go after, but if we find it, it's going to be of great worth, more than riches. And it really begins even our relationship with God. In chapter 1, remember he begins in verse 7, the fear of the Lord. If I'm ever going to obey God and let his purpose, let his plan unfold in my life totally, the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So if I don't go after wisdom, if I don't recognize how important wisdom is, he calls me a fool. As a matter of fact, and apparently I can't imitate it and come up with it on my own. Proverbs chapter 3 says this in verses 5 to 7. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. That Hebrew word trust is the word bathak. It means throw yourself in the ground in total surrender. So totally surrender to the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. The word is your own perceptions, your own opinions. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll make your pathways smooth. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord. Turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. So this wisdom thing, I can't come up with my own. As a matter of fact, if I try, it gets real ugly. The only real wisdom book in the New Testament is the book of James. And James says this in chapter 3, verses 13 and following. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior, his deeds, and the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that comes from heaven above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy, good fruits, unwavering, and without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So the point is, this wisdom thing, whatever this wisdom is a real key for me to be able to live a life that I can actually extract enjoyment from it and see that it is the first gift. Second gift being heaven itself. But Solomon's not going to talk about the second gift. He's only going to talk about life under the sun, from your physical birth to your physical death. Now, apparently, this wisdom thing is such an issue that when you have the description of Jesus growing up, it's interesting the comment that Luke makes. We don't have any real revelation about Jesus as a child or like a teenager or a young man. He's around age 30 before we start getting information about him. But you have this one comment, for example, in Luke chapter 2. Luke makes this comment in verse 40 when he says this. It's chapter 2. That's even better. verse 40. There it is. He says, and the child, verse 39, and when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they, that's Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, they returned to Galilee to their own city of Nazareth. And the child continued to grow and become strong. How so? Increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And just in case we didn't get that note, he repeats it again in the same chapter with verse 52, the last verse. And Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. So the point seems to be, whatever this wisdom thing is, it is something important. And it's something that I don't come up with myself. But somehow I've got to learn, how do I grow? How do I mature in this whole issue of wisdom? You know, it's interesting when I talk to people about their education. Very quickly we want to give our pedigree of schools or degrees. But we tend to stop learning once we finish school. So if you go through high school and then you go into the professional world, then you've pretty well accumulated, you think, everything you know. If you go to college, you learn 4 more years or whatever, but then you have accumulated basically everything you know, and you spend the rest of our life defending what we know, and we stop learning. You remember 2 weeks ago when he was talking about just because a man becomes old does not mean he's wise. Remember the picture of the young lad who learns to be and receive instruction. He's teachable, and so he just bypasses the king, and the king's forgotten. So just because you're old does not mean you're accumulating wisdom, only if you continue to be teachable. So we wonder, what grade are you in? I'm in the 9th grade, 10th grade. I'm in grade 57. Figured it out, I'm in grade 57. And I better be as much of a student today if I'm going to continue to learn. And what do I want to learn? I want to learn this thing called wisdom, because it seems to work for me. And indeed helps me enjoying life as a gift and not of some kind of a curse. A lot of people are failing out of the school of the real world. And so wisdom is only to those who desire to be wise. If you think you know everything you need to know, and anytime anybody gives you correction, input, you get mad, defensive, well, Proverbs 9 says you're a scoffer. And you are fossilized in what little you know. But if you are open, he says, but if you correct a wise man, he becomes wiser still. Why? Because he wants to keep learning. He knows he doesn't know it all. She knows she doesn't know it all. So they are open for correction and instruction and input. And just the fact that you're here tells me that you have a desire to keep learning, and I affirm you for it. So if we need to wise up to some people who aren't growing. If maybe you feel that you're a little stuck, maybe we need to start growing again, specifically in this thing called wisdom, so we can understand what it is. But first of all, what blocks the thing? And that's what he's going to do here. In verses 9 and 10, he says there's 2 things that will keep you from increasing in wisdom. 2 blocks to it. First one is in verse 9. Again, chapter 7. Solomon says, do not be eager in your heart to be angry, for anger resides in the bosom of fools. Now he says, don't be hasty to be quick to get angry. In our last study, he used the term short in spirit, short in sense. Don't be in a hurry to get mad. You say, mad at what? Proverbs 25, verse 28 says, like a city that's been broken into is the man who cannot control his anger. So this anger, if I keep getting mad, getting angry, that's going to stunt my growth in wisdom. Now, anger is an interesting emotion. You know, God's given us emotions because we are created in the image of God, and God has emotions. So we're going to reflect our Creator, and if our Creator has emotions, those emotions are going to be reflected in His children, in us. And yet, emotion, even our English word emotion, comes from two little Latin words, which means out, and motio, to move, energy to move out. And so the whole concept of emotion is that it generates energy within us. We even got organs called the adrenal gland, and our eyes will dilate, that our body actually goes through a change that's produced by emotions. Now, John Edrington writes this, I find this interesting. Quote, without the emotions, we would be literally lifeless. Having no desires or motivation, we would be just like a blob with nothing but a few reflexes to identify us as alive. But anger is an emotion. And here he says it's a blockage. Be careful, don't become angry. Don't get used to getting mad from within. And yet, he's talking about this emotion of anger. I get real confused because Paul, who studied under Gamaliel, and if Paul studied under Gamaliel, Gamaliel would have taught his students the wisdom writings of the Hebrew canon. So guess who probably studied this same book, this Journal of Solomon? Paul did as a rabbinic student. So Paul knows this thing better than you and I. And this is what he says in Ephesians 4. Verse 26, be angry, and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. Now here Paul uses an imperative, a command. And the command is, be angry. But when you get angry, don't sin. And don't let the sun go down on your anger. But then just about 2-3 verses later, he says this in verse 31. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. So can somebody help me out here? Solomon says, anger is going to block your increase in wisdom. Paul says, be angry, but don't sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. But anger needs to be put away with you, along with all slander and malice. Does anybody have an aspirin? Basically, well, what is he talking about here? Well, what he's talking about is what's interesting about the emotions. Is like I said, they generate energy. All the emotions do. So, for example, the emotion of fear. The emotion of fear generates within us an action to protect. To either protect ourselves or protect someone else. The emotion of affection. When you feel the emotion, the feeling of affection, it moves you to want to serve the object of your affection. The emotion of sorrow, sadness. You don't take medication for it. You let it do what it does, and it moves you out to reflection. For it forces you to reflect on what's making you so sad. Because the sooner you can articulate it, you're halfway out of it. Instead of it letting be a cloud that just stays between your ears and you just stay depressed. But this emotion of anger is the strongest of all the emotions. And it generates energy to correct that which is wrong. To correct what is wrong. See, in the context of Ephesians 4, when we see evil, we are to do something about it. We're to correct it. If you see an innocent child assaulted, you see a vulnerable lady being lied to and manipulated, you better get angry. That's what Paul says. Be angry, because after he says in Ephesians 4, be angry but do not sin, we'll get back to that. In the next chapter, chapter 5, he makes a statement in verse 11. Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. When you see evil and you're going to speak against it, you're going to do something to correct it, that takes a certain amount of courage, doesn't it? Easier just to keep your mouth shut and walk away. But what's going to generate the courage for you to correct that which is so morally wrong to an innocent? It's going to be your anger. Therefore, that's what Paul means. There's times, be angry. Be angry. The point of don't let the sun go down on your anger is that, like all emotions, emotions are temporary. So if you see an assault, if you see something that is evil in front of you, take care of it now while you're feeling the emotion to move you to do something. Because tomorrow morning you'll wake up and the emotion will be gone. So like all the emotions, they come and they go. So it is when you see injustice, you see evil, you see an assault upon innocence. That anger moves you to move now, to do, to say, to expose the evil. That's what he means by not letting the sun go down on your anger. It was Dr. J.H. Jowett who made this statement. A life incapable of anger is destitute of the needful energy for all reform. There is no blaze in it. There's no ministry of purification. If a city is to be purged from its filth, it will have to be by souls that are burning with moral resentment. It is the man who is fervent in spirit who will most assuredly serve the Lord. The grass withereth because the Spirit of the Lord breatheth upon it, and the church needs more of this withering breath and consuming energy that is born out of holy wrath against all established wrong. We are taught in the New Testament that this power of indignation is begotten by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit makes us capable of healthy heat, and it inspires the fire within us. The Holy Spirit never creates a character that is lukewarm, neutral, or indifferent. End of quote. Now, there's times to get angry. But he says, Solomon says, but anger is dangerous because it can block your growing in wisdom. Paul even warns, be angry, let it correct injustice and that which is wrong and do it now, but do not sin. So even Paul, when he commands us to be angry, warns us that it's dangerous. And then, of course, well, then when is anger wrong? When does it become dangerous? What does Solomon mean when he talks about anger? Anger does not. It resides in the bosom of fools. Matter of fact, James chapter 1, James simply says in verse 19, be quick to hear, but be slow to anger. And what does he say in verse 20 of James 1? For the anger of man does not accomplish the righteousness of God. That is the increase in growing in wisdom. Just like Solomon said. James probably got it from Solomon in the first place. Well, all that say this, well then when is anger dangerous? When is it sin? When is it wrong? Well, Paul answers that when he said it should be put away back in Ephesians 4. When he said this in verse 31, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Now notice, anger is not the first word, and Paul's not trying to impress us with his vocabulary. He's building something here. First of all, he says, let all bitterness. So I'm to put away bitterness. You ever ask Christians, do you struggle with bitterness? Oh, no, I'm a Christian. I don't ever get bitter. All right. Do you ever resent certain things or resent people? No, I'm a Christian. I never resent nobody. I love everybody, even the animals, dogs, and maybe cats. All right, then let me ask you this. Are you ever disappointed? Do you ever have expectations on people, on the way they would treat you or respond? Do you ever have expectations on life and they don't always work out the way you hoped and you feel this emotion called disappointment? Can you still be Christian and feel disappointment? Will you at least own up to that? Give me a head nod. All right, yeah. Well, the moment those emotions of disappointment, where they're consistently disappointed again and again and again, it gets to a point of resentment where you don't enjoy being around those things or those people who always let you down. And then finally, if it continues, it becomes where you begin to predict they're going to let you down. You're going to have an attitude that you're just going to assume that they're losers and they're going to break their promise, and all of a sudden, that is bitterness. So we all struggle with it because we all have expectations and we all experience disappointments. Well, if we don't do anything about the bitterness, it moves the wrath. The word is orge. Have you ever been irritated? That's what the word is. It's this constant low-grade anger of irritation. Makes you short in spirit, impatient. Now, if you don't do anything about that, then it moves to anger. Well, I'm trying to take anger control classes. That's like trying to get rid of the bumps of sandpaper. It's not going to happen. Anger, now, from anger, if you don't think about it, it moves to clamor. Have you ever met anybody who's always angry, short-fused? That's clamor. And then finally ends up with slander. That's the word blasphemia. Well, I thought we just blaspheme God. No, we blaspheme each other. Because if you consistently let me down, disappoint me, and finally I just know you're always going to, well, then whenever I'm around you, I'm going to be irritated with you, and there's going to be outbursts of anger where I punish you, and I'm going to basically, whenever you're around me, I'll always be that way. And when I open my mouth to describe you to somebody, it's probably going to come out blasphemia, negative, talking you down. Now, what is this all about? The word anger. This anger is produced by what? Bitterness. See, to be angry is to generate energy to correct that which is unjust, wrong in others. So if I see someone who is innocent and somebody being manipulated, somebody being oppressed, and it's someone else. Remember Philippians 2. Have this mind in you that was in Christ. To remember, to think of the interests of others as more important than your own. Now, I've erased that from my Bible, but every time I buy a new Bible, it shows up again. So my interest, my focus of my anger is when I see you being messed with. When I see evil to you, then I get angry. And I should be angry because that's my emotion to do something, to speak, to do something to protect the innocent, to bring about righteousness and justice. But if I'm angry because of injustice to me, my expectations aren't being met. What I want done is not happening. The way I want you to respond is not going to transpire. Then at that point, I get angry. That's from bitterness. So the idea is that be angry is moving you to protect others. If you're the issue, you shouldn't be the issue. And so don't, he says those who basically, now let's go back to what Solomon's talking about here, because he says the anger, it resides in the heart of a fool who will not grow in wisdom. What anger is this? This is somebody who's always mad. What are they mad at? They're mad at life. They're mad at the plan of God that he is unfolding in their life because it's not what they wanted. I wanted my plan, my bag to be filled with prosperity, happiness, and success. And yet I look at God's plan for my life, and it seems like everybody else gets the prosperity and I get the adversity. And so I am angry, and so he says, what is going to block your growth and growing in wisdom? If every time God has packed your bag, his plan for your life includes adversity, pain, some suffering, some disappointment, and you get angry every time because it's not meeting your expectations of what you wanted your life to be like. That's what he's talking about. When you put a fist in the face of God, he's not going to fulfill his promise of James chapter 1, verse 5. Remember in James says, when you encounter various trials, there in verse 2, when you encounter various trials, count it all joy. You know, that's one of those verses. It's like if someone's going to hit you in the mouth, lean into it. Why am I going to count it all joy when I'm going through hard adversity? Well, first of all, remember the word joy, kara. Doesn't mean giggle and enjoy it. It simply means don't be afraid of it. Remember, joy is the absence of fear. You could cry and still have joy as long as you're not afraid. And so what he says, when you encounter various trials, first, don't be afraid. But God has designed those trials to produce in you perseverance, which is going to produce in you a testing of faith that will produce in you a point of being complete and perfect as far as God's plan for your life. Then in verse 5 says, and if you're a little confused about it, let him ask God for wisdom. And God doesn't hesitate. He promises to give it to you. He'll give you the reason, the sense, how God will use adversity in his plan in your life and how he'll pull good out of it. The most remarkable thing about God's omniscience, God's infinite mind, is he can take any mess you create for yourself or any mess that other people create for you. And with that infinite wisdom, he can still pull good out of that mess. That's what Romans 8:28 is all about. For God can work good, can pull out good out of everything, anything, not for everybody, but those who love God and are what? Called according to his purpose, his plan, the bag that he's packing for you that's unique from anyone else. So even that adversity, God knows it's a necessity for him to be able to prepare you to be able to experience what he's got planned for you. So in that respect, you begin to see that he says the fool. Now, the fool is the one that's always angry because he's disappointed in the way his life is and the adversity and bad things in their life. So it's an anger that comes from their own disappointments and their own expectations not being met. But Solomon read his dad's stuff too. And it was his dad in Psalm 53 who began the psalm with, the fool says in his heart, there's no God. That's a statement of a fool. Because for a fool, there is no God. And so therefore, my will be done. You do what I say. I will control my life. And when you don't do what I say, and my life is not being what I want it to be, you're going to see my holy wrath, but it won't be holy. And that's why it's the fool who says there is no God who always gets angry. Because she thinks she is in control like a god of their own life. So he says here the first block to growing in wisdom, and we'll see what that is in a moment, a little bit. But the first block is that if every time you don't like the plan of God that he's unfolding in your life, you don't like the way he has packed your particular bag, and you're always getting angry, then a fist in God's face means you're not going to experience James 1:5. He's not going to give you wisdom to understand how he's going to pull good out of this horrible thing you're going through because you're too angry to even consider the possibility of it. But then there's a second block to wisdom he gives us in verse 10, and that's to be discontent. Discontent, verse 10. Do not say, why is it that the former days were better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask about this. It's a foolish statement to say, remember how good it used to be? The good old days. You know, we have the weirdest way of repressing and removing and purging all bad memories. And so man, wasn't it great when we were teenagers? Remember when you were 13 years old, how wonderful that was? No, that wasn't so wonderful. Especially if you were a 7th grader and a pre-puberter. Remember, guys, the first time you tried to kiss a girl? Oh, God. Gee. No, 13 wasn't so wonderful. Well, remember when you were 18? Wasn't so wonderful. Well, when I was 28, wasn't so wonderful. But what happens is that we use the past to have an excuse to be discontent for the present. And remember, life is havel. You experience life in the moment. You're never going to live life in the future, and you're not going to ever live life in the past. Future, plan for it. Past, learn from it. But don't let either distract you from the moment, because that's the only time you're going to live life. It's the only time you have a shot at being able to extract any kind of enjoyment. But if I go ahead and look the past to distract me, life is worse it's ever been. Well, first of all, that's a lie. It's not the worst it's ever been. But for right now, it feels like, let's just say it. Stop comparing it. It's just adverse. It's a bad season. This is not a lot of fun, but we use that as an excuse to be discontented. Remember what Psalm 118 verse 24 says? This is the psalm that every morning you get out of bed and your feet hit the ground. This is the day the Lord has made, and this day I will rejoice. I'll rejoice in it. But it's not as good as it was back 20 years ago. Jesus even said, don't worry about tomorrow, for today has enough stuff for you to focus on. Don't be distracted. So life now is worse than it's ever been before. No, it's not. And don't use that as an excuse to be discontented with what you have in this season and what's unfolding in God's plan for your life right now. For example, the Apostle Paul, he writes about this contentment in Philippians 4. As a matter of fact, he tells us first off that it's not natural. You're not born with being content. When you came out of your mother's womb, it wasn't very long before you were mad. You're mad because you were hungry, and you're mad. And that's why he says, not that I speak from want, verse 11 of Philippians 4, but I've learned to be content. This is something you learn or you don't. But I learned to be content in whatever circumstance I'm in. Now, this word content, he stole it, that's not a good thing, but he did. We call it research. But he stole it from the Stoic philosophers of the day. And the term contentment simply meant, like we've talked about this before, I need nothing more to enjoy my life. Are there more things I want? Sure, that's okay. Have your dreams and aspirations. But as far as increasing your enjoyment of life, I need no more. That's what contentment is here. And he knows what he says. Contentment when? When did this happen? How did you learn this stuff? I know how to get along with humble means. Those are bad days. Didn't have very much going on. But I also learned how to live in prosperity. Oh, those were good days. And in any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret. At this time, you had the proto-Gnostics, and they were all talking about religion was mystery and secrets, and you got to be part of our religion. This is a little bit of a problem with Mormonism, is that you got to work yourself up to discover the secrets. There's no secrets in truth. He says, but and he's kind of chiding the philosophers and these Gnostics, I've learned the secret of being filled. So I've learned how to enjoy the good days. When in my bag, the plan this day was a great day. And going hungry. I've also learned how to realize that some of my days I'm going to go hungry and they're not going to be great days. They may be filled with adversity. I've learned to have an abundance. Oh, those are great days. I got everything I wanted to do done. I got my checklist finished. And suffering need. Oh, there's going to be some of those days. My needs weren't met. It was horrible days. And then that's when he says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. It's basically coming to the point that I have learned to be content. Psalm 23 Is it enough? Like I've told you when we taught it, every day I quote it out loud so I can hear it. Why? Because I got to remember, Jesus, John 10, I am the good shepherd. My shepherd, I shall not, I have a shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes today, he makes me lie down in green pastures. If there's going to be things to enjoy, he's going to make it happen. And he'll lead me to quiet water so I can reflect, and he restores my soul. And he guides me towards wisdom, this thing. He guides me in the paths of righteousness, so I go on the right paths. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, there's danger always all around. He says, I fear no evil. And then the right in the middle of the psalm, literally the Hebrew is, you with me. Don't you like hearing that from your shepherd? You with me. He's always in his presence with us, just like Jesus promised. Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. And then he says, he prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And when I get beat up, those bad days, he anoints my head with oil. So I heal. It's always going to be, no, I will heal. So my cup is full. Then remember, he talks about this dear lady named Shirley. No, it's not Shirley. But he says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Surely goodness. Remember the word tov. God's going to have following me things designed by him, experiences, pleasures, people, events, opportunities that he's designed for me to extract enjoyment. Those are going to be good days. Days of abundance, days of prosperity. And he says, mercy will follow me. That's that Hebrew word chesed. Sometimes translated loving kindness. The Greek translation of it in the New Testament is agape. Love. It's to be concerned about the well-being. God, if no matter even the bad days, he's still committed, my shepherd's making sure of my well-being. And if I'm going through adversity or something that really, really hurts, it's only because it's necessary for God's plan for my life. You think of Job. Well, horrible things happened to Job. But don't forget chapters 1 and 2. Everything that happened to Job, no matter how horrible, was passed by the throne room of God himself. And for that man's life, God viewed it in his infinite wisdom as necessary for his plan for Job's life. So, the question I ask, Darryl, is Psalm 23 good enough? Can I be content? This is the day the Lord has made. And I don't know what kind of day it's going to be, but I am going to be content. This is going to be the day that the Lord has made, and I'm going to not be afraid of it, and I will embrace, no matter what happens this day. Discontentment is not from the growth of wisdom, but blocks it. So you got these two blockers to growing in wisdom. The one is anger, and the other one is being discontent. But, there's enough things to get angry about, and there's enough stuff that's disappointing that maybe I want to bail out of the plan of God. Do we have choice B? Can I put that fist in God's face and walk away from this thing and do my own thing? Well, then he comes back in verses 11 to 14. Let me remind you about the worth of wisdom. There's two things. If you get a handle on growing in wisdom, there's two good reasons for you to not bail out on this thing. The first is protection. The second is perspective. Look at verses 11 and 12. Protection. He says, wisdom along with an inheritance is good. Inheritance are the assets, the money that you leave or it's left to you by parents or someone who loves you. Wisdom along with inheritance is good, and an advantage to those who see the sun. Those who are still alive. They're still alive. They can see the sun. So wisdom and inheritance is a good thing for people who are after you but still alive. For wisdom is protection. just as money is protection. All right, there you go. That doesn't sound very spiritual. He says, but the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the lives of its possessors. So here he says, wisdom actually provides an advantage, especially when it's passed on from generation to generation, that protects the same way money protects. Proverbs 13 verse 8 says that the ransom of a man's life is in his riches. Back in these days, when you got in trouble, you got behind in debt, you could not pay your mortgage payments, there was something you or your family did and there's a fine. What saves your naga hide? Money. It's just, remember this is just raw honest, how are the puppies doing? Yeah, sometimes money will get you out of trouble. But here's what he's drawing a comparison. Money, and he admits, sometimes money will get you out of trouble. I know we dream about winning the lottery. We go, I can pay my mortgage off. I can buy a new car, and I can lose all my friends because they think I'll pay their mortgage off because now they know I can. So we even admit that money provides a certain element, for some things, of protection. Here, Solomon says, wisdom does the same thing. Wisdom can, what? Protection from what? Trouble you get yourself in because of bad choices. You make foolish decisions. You get in trouble. Sometimes money will get you out of that trouble. But all the time, wisdom can get you out of that trouble. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 32 and 33, Solomon says this, for the waywardness of the naive will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But he who listens to me shall live securely and shall be at ease from the dread of evil. First of all, if I can grow in this thing called wisdom, I'm going to stop making bad choices and thus getting myself in trouble. But even when I fail and I get myself in trouble, it's this thing called wisdom that can protect me just like money can protect me. Because if not, I can destroy myself. And not only myself, Proverbs 13 verse 20 says, I can destroy my companions with my own foolishness. How dangerous am I to be to those who hang around me? You hang around somebody wise, you're going to be able to feel the wisdom spill on you and the blessing and protection of it. You hang around a fool, you'll be hurt as deeply as they are. Now here when he's talking about this protection, he mentions the word wisdom and understanding. He keeps going back to wisdom and understanding, wisdom and understanding. Are these the same things? The word understanding is the Hebrew word dayat, D-A-A-T, dayat. And it speaks of knowing truth, growing in understanding of biblical instruction. So dayat, understanding, knowledge, is what you know. But here's the kicker. What you know doesn't help. The Bible doesn't work unless it's obeyed. That's why he says in James 1, verse 20 to 25, when he says, be not a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer. Verse 25, for this man, this woman shall be blessed in whatever they do. You could know the truth. You could know the commands of Christ. You could know the wisdom of Moses and Solomon. But if you don't know how to obey, that knowledge, all Paul says it does is puff you up. So you got all the answers, but your life's a ruin. And so he says this word wisdom is the word hakma. And hakma basically speaks of a skill, an art, an ability, a capacity to obey Scripture. Remember when Jesus in Matthew 28 sends them out And he says, now, as you go, make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Then remember the second participle, teaching them. And did he say, all that I've commanded you? That's not what he said. Teaching them to observe, obey all that I've commanded you. So you see, dayat is not enough. It's got to have, not only you got to know the truth, but you got to have this talent, this skill, this ability on how to take that truth and obey it in any situation. You say, well, how do I figure that out? That's the wisdom you're growing in. That's the skill that you're developing. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what Hebrews says at the last part of chapter 5. Listen to verses 13 and 14. He says, for everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, what is right, what is wrong, for he's a baby. So if all you know is dayat, you understand, you can even understand, I know what supralapsarianism, I know what the hypostatic union means. You can know all the highfalutin stuff, but you're a baby. And what are we talking about? Maturing in, where's the wisdom? Read on. But solid food, what's solid food? Is for the mature. What makes you mature? Who because of practice, they have their senses trained to discern good and evil. That's the wisdom. That's why Paul says in Colossians chapter 1, when he prays for the Christians in Colossae, he says, I'm praying for you that you grow both in knowledge and wisdom. So the knowledge we can study, we can learn, you can listen and write notes. So I'm teaching you a lot of dayat. But for it to make any effect and thus be protective in your life, it's only be when you let the Spirit of God, James 1:5, give you the skill, the art on how to obey what you know when it comes to treating your children, when it comes to treating your wife, treating your husband, treating the tax collector, treating the retailer, treating the person who burned you and lied about you. That's the wisdom, the art. That's the skill. That's why it's a skill. And the protection is to secure you from those passions and excesses, the trouble you get yourself into or other people get you into. When you know how to obey the scriptures and then ask God to give you the wisdom of how to obey it, know it, then obey it. The second thing, and we got to close here, is perspective. And that's the last couple verses. Consider the work of God. For who is able to straighten what he has bent? Do you really think that you can change God's plan for your life? Do you really think you can kind of straighten out what he seems to bend? There's a perspective here. He says, verse 14, in the day of prosperity, be happy. Do your little dance. And don't be ashamed of it. There are good days. Remember the great theologian John Denver? Some days will be diamonds, and some days will be stones. Puppies didn't know that song. You ought to go hear that song. You never heard that, did you? Right? I used that illustration with a college at a lecture at ECU. They didn't have a clue. So he says, in the day of prosperity, be happy. When the days are diamonds, do your Irish dance. But in the days of adversity, consider this before you get mad or discontent. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not discover anything that will be after him. Stop trying to figure out the plan. God will unfold the plan. Dr. Walt Kaiser put it this way: look with wonder, admire, and silently wait for the result of God's work. The contrasts of life are deliberately allowed by God so that men should ultimately develop a simple trust and dependence in God. For prosperity and the good from God's hand, be thankful, rejoice. But in adversity and crookedness of life, think. Reflect on the goodness of God and the comprehensiveness of his plan for man. See, the second benefit is simply this: the perspective. That if I can take the good and enjoy the good things that God has put in his plan for my life, then I have the maturity, the perspective to know if there are bad things that God permits in my life, they're necessary for God's plan to be completed in my life. If I'm ever going to learn to be a compassionate person, he better have some real pain for me to experience and to feel, or I'll never have a capacity to feel anybody else's pain. He better put it so that I have some people burn me, so I have to forgive them, so that I know how to be forgiven. You see, the perspective is to realize God's goodness, God's mercy follow me all the days of my life. And his plan is perfect. You know, some of you have more than I have, financially, bigger homes, wealthier, your future's all secure. I'm still working. Thank God for 2008. It's kept me in ministry, I'll tell you that much. But you want to know something? I love my life. Some days are like diamonds and some days are like stones. But apparently in my bag I need diamonds and stones so that I can have the depth and become all that God has planned to complete his work in my life. And when I stop fighting it and getting angry at it and getting distracted from it, but just embrace it, and when I don't understand, I ask for wisdom, the skill, the talent, the capacity to obey, even trusting God during the hard times, he'll give it to you. And if he's got to call you on the phone, he'll do that too. God bless you. Lord willing, we'll see you next week. We'll pick it up then.